Welcome to my story time by mybooksummary.com. Get ready for quick wisdom of countless stories and explore. The Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. The Vietnam War is one of the most complex, controversial, and consequential conflicts in modern history. It wasn't just a war. It was a cultural, political, and ideological earthquake that reshaped the world. For the United States, it was a painful lesson in the limits of military power and the dangers of ideological crusades. For Vietnam, it was a brutal struggle for independence and reunification. And for the world, it was a stark reminder of the human cost of war. Lasting from 1955 to 1975, the Vietnam War was a conflict that defied easy explanations. It was a civil war, a proxy war, and a guerrilla war all rolled into one. It pitted the communist forces of North Vietnam and the Viet Cong against the US-backed government of South Vietnam. It was a war of jungles and napalm, of protests and politics, of heroes and villains. But more than anything, the Vietnam War was a war of contradictions. It was fought in the name of freedom, yet it led to widespread oppression. It was meant to contain communism, yet it fueled anti-American sentiment around the world. It was a war that divided nations, families, and generations. In this deep dive, we'll explore the origins, key events, and lasting impact of the Vietnam War. We'll meet the leaders who shaped the conflict, the soldiers who fought in it, and the civilians who endured its horrors. And by the end, you'll understand why the Vietnam War remains a defining moment in the history of the 20th century. Chapter 1: The Origins from Colonialism to Cold War. To understand the Vietnam War, we need to go back to the 19th century when Vietnam was part of French Indochina. For decades, the Vietnamese people lived under colonial rule, their resources exploited, and their culture suppressed. But in the early 20th century, a nationalist movement began to take shape, led by figures like Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was a communist, but he was also a patriot. He dreamed of an independent Vietnam, free from foreign domination. During World War II, he saw an opportunity. With France weakened by the war, Ho's Viet Minh forces fought against both the Japanese occupiers and the French colonial authorities. After Japan's surrender in 1945, Ho declared Vietnam's independence. But the French weren't ready to let go of their colony. What followed was the First Indochina War, a brutal conflict that lasted from 1946 to 1954. The Viet Minh, using guerrilla tactics and popular support, gradually wore down the French. The war ended with the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, a stunning Viet Minh victory that forced France to the negotiating table. At the Geneva Conference in 1954, Vietnam was temporarily divided along the 17th parallel. The North was controlled by Ho Chi Minh's communist government, while the South was led by a US-backed regime under Ngo Dinh Diem. The plan was to hold elections in 1956 to reunify the country, but those elections never happened. Instead, the division became permanent, setting the stage for the Vietnam War. Chapter 2: The Escalation: America's Growing Involvement. In the early 1960s, the United States began to take a more active role in Vietnam. President John F. Kennedy, fearing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, sent military advisors and equipment to support the South Vietnamese government. But it wasn't enough. The South Vietnamese army was struggling to contain the Viet Cong, a communist insurgency that operated in the South. After Kennedy's assassination in 1963, President Lyndon B. Johnson inherited the conflict. Johnson was determined to prevent a communist victory, but he was also wary of escalating the war. That changed in 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was a turning point. After reports of North Vietnamese attacks on U.S. ships, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving Johnson broad authority to escalate the war. By 1965, the United States was fully committed. American troops poured into Vietnam, and the bombing campaign against the North intensified. Chapter 3: The War on the Ground: A Brutal and Unwinnable Conflict. The Vietnam War was unlike any war the United States had fought before. It was a war of jungles and rice paddies, of ambushes and booby traps. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces were masters of guerrilla warfare, using hit-and-run tactics to frustrate the American and South Vietnamese armies. For American soldiers, the war was a nightmare. They faced not only enemy fire but also the harsh terrain, the oppressive heat, and the constant threat of ambush. The Viet Cong's use of tunnels, landmines, and snipers made every step a potential death trap. The war was also marked by atrocities on both sides. The My Lai massacre, in which U.S. soldiers killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians, became a symbol of the war's brutality. But the Viet Cong also committed atrocities, targeting villages and civilians suspected of supporting the South. Chapter 4. The War at Home, Protests, Politics, and a Nation Divided. While the war raged in Vietnam, it also divided the United States. The anti-war movement grew rapidly, fueled by images of violence and destruction on the nightly news. Protests erupted on college campuses in cities and even at the Democratic National Convention in 1968. The war became a defining issue in American politics. President Johnson, facing mounting criticism, decided not to run for re-election in 1968. His successor, Richard Nixon, promised to end the war with honor, but his policies, including the invasion of Cambodia and the bombing of North Vietnam, only deepened the conflict. The war also had a profound impact on American culture. It inspired songs, movies, and books that capture the anger, disillusionment, and heartbreak of the era. For many Americans, the Vietnam War was a symbol of everything that was wrong with their country. Chapter 5. The Endgame. Withdrawal and Fall of Saigon. By the early 1970s, the United States was looking for a way out of Vietnam. Nixon's policy of Vietnamization aimed to transfer responsibility for the war to the South Vietnamese army. At the same time, secret negotiations with North Vietnam led to the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, which called for a ceasefire and the withdrawal of U.S. troops. But the peace was short-lived. Without American support, the South Vietnamese army quickly collapsed. In April 1975, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. The fall of Saigon marked the end of the war and the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule. Chapter 6. The Legacy. A war that changed everything. The Vietnam War had far-reaching consequences. For Vietnam, it was a devastating conflict that left millions dead and the country in ruins. But it was also a war of independence, a struggle for self-determination that ultimately succeeded. For the United States, the war was a painful lesson in the limits of military power. It shattered the myth of American invincibility and led to a period of introspection and reform. The war also had a lasting impact on American foreign policy, shaping the way the United States approaches conflicts to this day. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Vietnam War is the human cost. Millions of lives were lost, and countless others were forever changed. The war left scars on the soldiers who fought in it, the families who lost loved ones, and the nations that were torn apart by it. Final thoughts. Remembering Vietnam. The Vietnam War is a story of courage and tragedy, of hope and despair. It's a story that reminds us of the complexity of war and the importance of understanding history. As we look back on the Vietnam War, we should remember not just the battles and the politics, but the people who lived through it. Their stories are a reminder of the human cost of war and of the enduring hope for peace. So, the next time you hear about the Vietnam War, don't think of it as a distant chapter in history. Think of it as a story that continues to shape our world today, a story of struggle, sacrifice, and survival. Stay tuned for more enlightening content. Head over to www.mybooksummery.com. Don't forget to subscribe and share the magic with friends, and let's grow together through the power of books and interesting stories.